Hi, everyone. So we are going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this is pages 512 to 513 in your text. So post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes it's referred to as PTSD. By definition, it's a long-lasting disorder that develops in response to an extreme physical or psychological trauma, events that produce intense feelings of horror and helplessness. So it's originally associated with people who've been through military combat. In fact, back in World War I, it was referred to as shell shock. They've also called it combat fatigue in the past. But over the years, they've realized that it can develop in survivors of pretty much any extreme traumatic situation, such as natural disasters, physical or sexual assault, or even terrorist attacks. It is estimated that more than 5 million U.S. adults experience PTSD. More than twice as many women as men experience PTSD after exposure to trauma, and even children can experience PTSD. So there are 4 clusters of symptoms for PTSD, and the first one is the person frequently recalls the event. So these recollections, they're intrusive, they're unwanted, and they interfere with normal thoughts, and they can be triggered by unrelated events. So some people with PTSD will report, for example, if they hear a siren, for example, an ambulance is going by and they hear that, that can actually trigger certain things. If they're used to having those loud noises, military members might, go back into and actually revisit in their minds and feel as if they're back in that situation, back in the combat zone. The person will also avoid stimuli or situations that tend to trigger memories of the experience. So they will avoid things like, for example, I know military members who will not go anywhere where there's going to be guns fired, because hearing firing guns, it brings back, for example, it'll bring back that recall. It'll put them into those situations. So they avoid that. They avoid anywhere where they have to go where they could be experiencing these things. They can also experience negative alterations in thinking, moods, and emotions. They could feel alienated from others. They might blame themselves for the traumatic events or blame other people for what happened. They might feel a sense of guilt or fear or anger. It is not uncommon for people who have been through events that have created PTSD to try to distance themselves from other people. They try not to form close bonds with people. They push people away. And even people who they're close to in a relationship, they might push that person away. So for example, it's not uncommon for veterans who've been through combat to come home and end up pushing their spouse away. Maybe they've been married for years. They push that spouse away, and the couple ends up divorcing because that veteran's PTSD has caused such issues and caused him to push her away. The final piece of the symptoms, it is the increased physical arousal. So the person might be easily startled, have sleep disturbances, have problems concentrating, trouble with remembering, prone to irritability or those angry outbursts. They are constantly vigilant. They know everything that's going on around them. It is not uncommon for people with severe PTSD to always be looking for an escape route out of a room. They have that hypervigilance, and they will know right where every exit is, and they'll have an escape route should anything happen. And it's all part of their PTSD. It leaves them feeling like they need to know how to get out. Some of them are what they refer to as like trigger happy. They will be ready at a moment's notice to, somebody startles them, they might turn around and punch them. Just a natural reaction that they have as a way of protecting themselves. Because a lot of this has to do with their exposure to the trauma, left them feeling vulnerable, and left them feeling a need to protect themselves. So just a few things to keep in mind with this. And one of the big things with this, the source of the disorder is actually the traumatic event. The cause does not lie within the individual. So even someone who's really well adjusted and psychologically healthy can develop PTSD if and when exposed to a traumatic event. So a key thing is exposure to trauma is necessary for the development of PTSD. No stressor produces post-traumatic stress disorder in everyone. So why do some people get it and others don't? Well, biological predisposition is one thing they're considering. You also have to look at, there are people who might have a personal or family history of psychological disorders. They're more likely to develop PTSD when exposed to an extreme trauma. The magnitude of the trauma plays a significant role. The more extreme the stressor, the more likely that person is to develop PTSD. And of course, the frequency exposure. People who undergo multiple traumas have a higher incidence of PTSD. So in situations like this, there's no rhyme or reason why some people develop it and some people don't. It has to do with the trauma. It has to do with family history. And it's important to note that it is not limited to just military. It is not limited to a small group of people. This is something that anybody can suffer from just based off of, if they had something where they felt their life was threatened, where they felt their life was endangered, then a person can develop PTSD. And as we talked about, the responses could be anything from deciding to withdraw and not talk to people. Perhaps they will, completely change and move away from everyone. There are a lot of things that can happen. It's also important to note that suicide rates are actually pretty high in people who develop PTSD because they can't get over those feelings of guilt. They can't get over those feelings of anger. They keep reliving these events. They have to relive them time and time again in their mind, and it makes it very difficult for them to function. So it's important to note that all of these things can occur with people who are suffering from PTSD. When we talk about treatments and things like that, there are treatments for those who have PTSD. It is not uncommon for them to be put on things like antidepressants and things like that, and to be put on medication to help them with this, to help them to be able to function in society, and to help them to stop reliving these things time and time again. So that's the discussion of PTSD. We will move on and talk about obsessive compulsive disorder in the next PowerPoint.